Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into one of the most fascinating mysteries of human existence, how we actually managed to understand our ancient past. Now, when most of us think about history, we immediately picture stories, right? We think about those written accounts buried in dusty library books, or those rich oral traditions passed down from generation to generation around a crackling fire. But what happens when the voices finally fade and the ink completely washes away?
Okay, let's dive right into this, because this is exactly where our understanding of the ancient world usually hits a massive wall. We tend to assume that if something wasn't written down, or if the stories weren't told loudly enough to echo through the centuries, then that history is just lost to the void. But honestly, that simply isn't true. There is an entirely different, incredibly tangible way that history manages to cheat time and preserve the memories of our ancestors.
Through objects. It's really that simple, and honestly, that profound. Long after the storytellers are gone, the things they actually held, the tools they used, and the structures they built, they remain. These surviving physical items are the true, unshakable anchors of our ancient history.
And we call these things artifacts. Basically, it's a physical item that just survives long after the folks who created it are gone. And what's wild is, whether we're looking at the misty ancient landscapes of Ireland or the sun-baked ancient lands of Israel, these surviving objects reveal a remarkably similar pattern of human preservation. So today, we're going to explore these two distinct ancient peoples, the Irish and the Jewish people, and see how their physical histories stretch back thousands of years to tell a truly parallel story of survival and identity.
Before we put them side by side, we kind of need to understand what an artifact actually does. They act as evidence. They're basically the ultimate detective clues. First up, they show us what people valued, like what materials were precious enough to hoard or trade. Second, they show us how they lived, the literal tools they used to farm, build, and just survive. And third, they show us what they believed, the symbols they carefully carved into stone and metal. In both the Irish and Jewish historical contexts, we rely heavily on these exact objects to be the primary evidence of their ancient pasts. So let's compare Ireland and Israel, looking at their shared foundation of physical history. Now, what's really interesting here is the contrast in the actual materials, yet the striking similarity in what they represent. In Ireland, the deep archaeological record is totally dominated by massive stone structures, elaborate burial sites, and highly intricate metalwork. Meanwhile, over in Israel, the record spanning thousands of years gives us complex structures, everyday survival tools, and crucial early inscriptions. The specific items are completely different, perfectly adapted to their unique environments. But if you look closer, both records independently reflect an incredibly long continuous human presence and highly complex, organized societies. And you have to remember, these aren't just isolated knickknacks sitting in a museum display. They form a sequential record of human evolution. Step 1 is settlement. The earliest objects show us exactly where and how these groups first put down roots. Step 2 is culture. We start seeing art, distinct pottery, community rituals. And step 3 is development. The artifacts get way more complex, showing major technological leaps and societal growth. In both of these distinct cultures, this sequence is quite literally written directly into the earth.
Which brings us to a massive concept, continuity. Because despite all the massive changes over time, and despite the periods of immense disruption and hardship that both the ancient Irish and ancient Jewish peoples faced, these artifacts provide a visible thread. They are a vital tether that connects the past directly to the present, making sure the story is never completely interrupted.
Next, let's look at the practical and symbolic meanings, the incredible dual purpose of these artifacts.
Because an artifact is almost never just a functional tool. Humans just have this profound need to pack their physical world with deeply held beliefs and values, and this brilliantly illustrates how both cultures slot perfectly into that framework. In Ireland, you have these practical items completely covered in complex designs and patterns, but those patterns serve a symbolic meaning as deep cultural motifs, like those intricate swirls on ancient metalwork. Over in Israel and the Levant, functional tools and structures reflect deeply rooted religious tradition and community life. In both regions, an everyday object is elevated to a symbol of the people themselves.
They are practical, and they are symbolic. Honestly, this dual purpose is the absolute core of why these objects matter so incredibly much to modern descendants today. They aren't just an old hammer or an old pile of stones. They are physical manifestations of an ancient mindset. It's literally a worldview preserved in solid matter.
But we do have to acknowledge a major complication here when interpreting the silent past and the absolute miracle of preservation.
Because when we talk about these amazing objects, it is so easy to forget the sheer crushing scale of time. It's estimated that an overwhelming 95% of material culture from the ancient world is simply gone, turned to dust, decayed, destroyed, or buried forever. The entire foundation of our historical knowledge, it rests on a miraculous surviving 5% fraction.
So, the crucial point we have to keep in mind is the scale of time we're dealing with. Thousands of years. To maintain any form of cultural continuity over that much time is a mind-blowing feat. For the physical objects of both ancient Ireland and ancient Israel to survive the elements, the wars, and the shifting empires over millennia, it's nothing short of astonishing.
But because we only have that tiny surviving fraction, we run into a bit of a challenge. Artifacts do not speak for themselves. They require interpretation. An ancient coin or a carved piece of stone cannot just shout its story out loud. It requires context. It requires rigorous analysis. And naturally, different experts interpreting the exact same silent object can come up with entirely different historical conclusions. That's what makes this field so incredibly dynamic.
Let's bring this into the present day, anchoring modern identity and connecting the past to the present.
Because these objects aren't just for academics in dusty basements. They actively build cultural identity for millions of people right now. They form the very pillars of modern identity. They provide undeniable evidence of history, a deep, tangible connection to a specific place, and proof of continuity across generations. And what's fascinating is that this function, material remains forming identity, is universal. We even see it across vastly different, more modern historical systems, like the German colonial empire, where physical remains are used to actively construct the memory and identity of a whole era. History is not just about the past. It actively shapes how people understand themselves today. Artifacts make history tangible. When a modern Irish person looks at ancient Celtic metalwork, or a modern Jewish person looks at an ancient inscription from the Levant, they aren't just looking at old stuff. They are looking into a mirror reflecting their own origins.
Let's bring this all together and see how this builds. This shared framework between both groups reveals 4 clear steps. 1. The artifacts provide a long historical record. 2. They reflect rich symbolic meaning. 3. They demonstrate unyielding continuity over time. And 4. They connect present identity directly to past experience. The parallels between Ireland and Israel through these 4 shared functions are, frankly, incredibly striking.
Now, I want to be entirely clear here as we wrap this up. We are absolutely not saying these 2 cultures are identical. The specific artifacts are entirely different, and the cultures are beautifully distinct. But the role that these artifacts play, the underlying human mechanism of preserving identity through physical objects across thousands of years, that shows a brilliantly clear, undeniable parallel. Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to take away from this explainer. We've seen how physical objects connect these ancient peoples to their modern descendants. But what about the things we can't hold? If physical objects reveal such strong parallels in how identity is formed, could abstract conceptual symbols, like the motif of the all-seeing eye, transcend physical boundaries too? Are historical connections sometimes not just physical but entirely conceptual? Think about that, and I'll see you in the next explainer.